Hello, Pastor David. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, David. It's an honor to be here.
Oh no, the honor is all mine. And before we get into the conversation today, we chatted a little bit yesterday. It was, I remember mentioning I wish I was recording yesterday because our conversation was so like insightful and rich. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. But before we get into the meat of the conversation, I was wondering if you could just give us a brief introduction of who you are and what you do.
Oh, wow. Geez, I guess briefly, I'm a pastor of a local church called Open Table Community. I'm a photographer, real estate investor, and gotten into business model coaching.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
How do you do all of that? Yeah.
Uh, I think the secret is not to do any of those things very well. But yeah, I have a lot of, I guess, side hobbies and things that I enjoy doing. And yeah, that's how I got into this.
Oh wow. So wait, can I ask a question about business model coaching? Is
Yeah.
what exactly is that?
So there's this thing called the business model generation, or using a business model canvas. So it's a template for how to sort of walk through explaining a business model process.
Hmm.
So it's a visual template that helps you uh, sort of discern how your business operates and how you sort of meet customer needs
Hmm.
and create value. So it's really good for startups or even long time standing businesses for them to review to see like, hey, how did the mechanics of us reaching our audience or the people that we're wanting to serve, how does it actually work?
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That, and how did you get into that?
Well, I had been interested in it with a friend of mine, but I got certified and went through a workshop during COVID. So
Hmm.
that really helped, and it gave me a model to work from. And there was this online training which included people from all around the world for, gosh, 2 or 3 months. I forget exactly how long, but basically, you just run this sort of template over and over, and that's how you sort of get certified.
Oh, interesting. So, if there are any people out there listening, and because so many small businesses got started during COVID times,
Yeah.
if there are people out there listening who want guidance on that, can they reach out to you?
Of course. Yeah, that's what I'd like to do.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So you guys heard it here. Please reach out to Pastor David if you need guidance on that. The thing that kind of I wanted to talk about today, yeah, I actually reached out to Pastor David, not really knowing what I wanted to talk about, but when we were talking yesterday, it was clear to me like one really interesting thing that isn't really talked about amongst our circles is just about the Korean church. And so I wanted to ask you first of all, open table community. Like I looked at the website. It doesn't look like I'm sure it's not a Korean American church, right? It's like the staff at least looked very diverse.
Yeah, I don't think it's a Korean American church at all.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's a hard church to describe, but I think one of the things that we're focusing on is really trying to be communal
Mhm.
and also trying to ask questions about restructuring church.
Mhm.
And sometimes the structure of church is prevents it from being reimagined or restructured. So we try to ask those questions regularly. Who is the church really for?
Mhm.
And how do we make sure the church is designed to meet the people that it's really for?
Yeah, and I think when you talk about restructuring church, that's the thing that was really interesting to me, and I wanted to get deeper into. But before that, can you? Because when we talked yesterday, you mentioned how you were a youth group pastor at a Korean American church before, but now you are at a church that is not Korean American. So I wanted to ask like what were some of the motivations of leaving the Korean American church? Not that it's wrong to leave the Korean American church,
Yeah,
but
not at all.
just like your motivations for that, and some of the things that you see about the Korean American church, both as an insider and now as kind of an outsider.
Yeah, so just for full disclosure, my dad was an immigrant pastor, church pastor as well. So from the age of 9, he when I was at least from the age when I was 9, he had been pastoring or planting churches in the southeast United States for most of my life, most of my adult life for sure. So when I started going back, so I had a bit of a wilderness season in my 20s.
Mm,
And then when I came back to church, it was to sort of a multi-ethnic and charismatic setting
mm,
um, in Nashville, Tennessee. And when I moved to Atlanta, I realized that there was more strength in the Korean community, and so I returned to sort of an immigrant church, and they had an English ministry there, and so I um, I really enjoyed meeting at a Korean church and sort of found like, oh, this is I've been missing certain things, and then I got to see Atlanta's I think it's the biggest city I've lived in.
mm,
Most I grew up most of my life in the southeast as a Korean American kid, and seeing all these Koreans or this sort of stronger critical mass of Korean community was really invigorating
mm,
and exciting. But I think one of the things that sort of gave me a sort of alternative voice was my wife. I When I moved to Atlanta, I almost immediately got married to someone I had been dating for 4 6 years prior. Um, but she's not Korean. She's Indian American,
mhm,
South Asian. We went to an Indian church as well, just for sort of getting a broad palette. And she wasn't raised Christian; she was actually raised Hindu.
mm,
So then, when we had this sort of new lens of sort of visiting ethnic churches, we started to recognize like there's some beautiful things about this church, but also like, hey, this doesn't quite fit like us, or there are some things that feel really I don't know what to say. Like there's a bubble here, which is
mm,
either both a bubble of safety and comfort. But one of the things that because my wife became Christian later in life, she just asked some really good questions about like really sort of puzzling questions like why do churches have walls? And you start thinking
huh,
because she was like I had to wait until my 20s to really hear the gospel. So why don't you do everything possible to make sure people hear it?
mm,
And it was like, so she's like, I don't think churches should have walls. I think you should, make sure that even people walking by, driving by, that they could hear the gospel, even incidentally. And
mm,
I was like, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I guess maybe they do it to make sure they don't waste air conditioning. And you're just trying to like, I don't know. And then why do you have Christian radio stations? I know it's because people don't want to hear the bad language of other songs. But she was like, well, then why aren't you at least pushing out your music to other stations? And I was like, well, maybe they don't want to hear Christian music. She was like, I understand that you don't want the world's music or this type of gangster rap on your station. I get that. But there's some goodness in your music. You have a message to your music that you should be trying to get out to other stations. And that was like really started to beg some questions about like, hey, why is it that we're insulating ourselves from the world rather than engaging it?
yeah,
And so while I did serve in the Korean church as a youth pastor for a few years, I had some friends after sort of the significant class of the youth had graduated, and the church had endured a number of splits before I had got there. So by the time I'd gotten there, it was a pretty small group, and I just tried to make sure that the majority of them graduated. And then I sort of said, I think it's time for me to go to seminary and sort of pursue some of these questions that I've been asking about our multi-ethnic or sort of cultural gifts that we bring to the body.
mhm,
But then I started asking questions about what cultural sins do we also bring into the body that we might need to address. And that's what sort of took me to seminary. And so I said, well, maybe it's good if I get out of Korean space so I can at least sort of start to see and understand a little bit better from a different headspace.
yeah. That's fascinating because when I think about like the good things that Korean American churches bring is like especially for the first generation, they have the dawn prayer, right? Where
Wow.
they go to church at like 6 a.m. every morning. I'm convinced that I made it through college because my mom was praying over me like all those mornings. Like that's really good. But I can think of also really bad things as well. One of the things is, so this is kind of my biggest critique of the Korean American church is it's kind of a joking saying is white churches, they multiply by planting churches. Korean churches multiply by splitting churches. So I definitely like resonate with what you're saying. But do you have any other examples of some of those um, things that you found that were like cultural sins or maybe even blessings?
Well, I think that Koreans in general, both in business and in church, we tend to imitate um, to the point of I think we really care about getting the action right. And
Mm,
even our theology, we want to make sure it's right.
mm,
There's a book, actually, I think it was a Harvard business book, where the scholar was making the claim that what Koreans do really well is they make copies really well. So when
mm,
Motorola came out with this phone, Samsung or LG came out with this copy that looked very similar, but they were offering at a cheaper price. Even now, like Kia was Kia cars, sometimes they look like, oh, I see where they borrowed this thing from BMW and they have borrowed this look from Mercedes Benz. And I think that's sort of, we do that spiritually as well. We borrow
mm,
heavily from John Piper, Hillsong. We to the point where it's hard to see where our cultural distinctiveness is and maybe could be.
mm,
So one of my big sort of, I've been harping on this for over a decade now, is that when our worship is borrowed, when our vocabulary for worship and liturgy is borrowed language, it's the equivalent of using a Hallmark card and trying to give it to your significant other to say, like, I feel like that's what this is how I feel, but it's not
mm,
how I feel. Those are just the Hallmark words. Some writer for Hallmark wrote those words and I just sign it.
mm,
Oh, me too, love David. And unfortunately, I don't know if God like, it might be beautiful worship coming out of Hillsong and David Crowder and Passion and all that, but it's still not authentic to ourselves, and it may not address our deep needs and deepest wounds.
mm. Yeah, and I remember I talked about this on this podcast with the previous guest. When you walk into like a Caucasian church, you can kind of tell, like, even if you're not looking, you hear it. Like when you walk into like a black church,
Yeah,
even if you're not looking, you can hear, oh, this is a different type of church. But when you walk into a Korean church, you can be like, oh, this might be a white church. This might not be. Like there's, like you were saying, there's not this distinct, I mean, just to like narrow it down, even in our worship, there's not a distinct way that we do it. But
right.
what would be the solution for that? Because I've heard about this and I recognize that as an issue as well. But when it comes to like trying to really figure out how do we make it authentically us, authentically Korean, like I couldn't really come up with a way to go about doing that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the first part is to actually recognize this tendency exists, right?
Mm,
Whether it's K-pop, whether it's business, whether it's church, if it's true, like if the hypothesis sort of resonates, like, hey, we actually have this tendency to borrow other people's language models, liturgy. What would it like? That's one of the reasons why we have such a hard time actually forming language for ourselves, is because we don't have we number one, we don't want to acknowledge it. Number two, it's like, well, we're really damn good at it, so that's
mm,
why we don't do it, is we're so good at imitating. Like, I know people that can pull off the choruses of Hillsong to the T. Like, it's like, yeah, I can get why it's actually easier to hide behind these performances than to actually be yourself. But we actually have to come from behind the curtain. We have to come from behind our instruments and actually say, who are we before God and before our community? What wounds do we have that need to be negotiated and confessed openly? And I think once we can actually name that sin of performance and hiding behind the imitation of others, then I think we can actually do some real work. But the real work does involve uh, addressing our collective trauma, our collective tendency for addiction to work, addiction to performance, addiction to shaming, addiction to all kinds of things,
yeah.
even hedonism, right? I mean, those things are running rampant in consumerism. where those things will not be transformed by the gospel until we can actually name them and confess them and then repent.
Mm,
Pretending like we can do church without doing those things. I mean, that's exactly what the enemy wants, is to have a group of collective churches that have no flavor.
mm-hmm,
Like we're benignly saying that we believe in Jesus, but we have no backbone.
mm. Wow. So then, and just because of the way that I think, um, it, I just need to be able to swallow like actionable things.
Yeah,
So one of the ways, so I hear you when you say like we gotta recognize it and like repent of it. So
yeah.
that's really actionable. That's good. But do you think, because you used a Hillsong as an example of something that we kind of hide behind, like would it even require something as big as like producing our own like worship music and things like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think
Mm,
one of the things that's different from the African American community versus the Asian American community, and this is, again, we're painting in very broad strokes here,
mhm,
but
mhm,
in the African American community, they have preachers as young as 13, 12, 11. If they sense the gift of preaching in you, or that you have something to say, even if you're not a preacher but you got something to say,
mhm,
they will encourage that. Hey boy, say it with your chest. Like, come on out, like, say it again. You say it louder, and that type of encouragement, that type of like, hey, you have something of value, and you may not think that it's value, but the community wants to affirm you and bring that out. Whereas I think of myself growing up in a Korean setting is like, even if I thought I had something to say, well, who am I to say it?
mhm,
Number
mhm,
one. And
mhm.
number two, why would anybody listen to me? I have no degree, no, I'm not ordained. Like, I have tons of disqualifying reasons.
Right.
So I think one of the things that our generation can sort of help do is to say, like, your song may not be as good as so and so's song. You may not be any Chris Tomlin, but you know what? We don't know any David Shins. And we need David Shin to write us a song for our community.
Mm,
You know what I mean?
mhm,
We need a preacher like David Shin, not like John Piper. I can listen to him on YouTube. I can find whomever on somewhere else, but this is the only place that I can get somebody to preach who looks like me, grew up like me, is fighting the same demons as me, and I need you to preach from that space.
mhm.
And I think once we start to say, like, hey, say it with your chest, say it louder, rather than who are you? you know, what are you? Yeah, digo
Right.
dugunde. That type of attitude needs to be like put aside,
Mm,
because we've been suppressing voices, both women, children, and then the unordained, the unqualified, the unprofessional. What we have to recognize is the Christian life is not professional.
mm,
It's for the amateur, it's for the novice, it's for the intermediate. Like, we need to make sure that people who are following Jesus can do this from a young age.
mhm,
There's no junior Holy Spirit. If a 10-year-old is feeling like, hey, I feel like the Spirit is calling me this, we need to affirm that, not to
mhm.
say like, you are 10, go back and listen to your mom, you ain't got nothing to say. Like, we need to stop that sort of cultural suppression.
Yeah.
We need to encourage that and say, like, you know what, in Korea, we would have to qualify you and vet you, and the tamim moksanim and this and this and that, and you're, but we need to actually say, you know what, this is actually a very unique space. To be in a Korean American or Asian American space is actually a very unique space
Yeah.
in our culture and society. And we need to make sure that the part of the uniqueness is an affirmation. And other aspects of their world, their affirmation comes from their academic performance, their athletic performance, their musical performance, their other, like, who knows, TikTok numbers, Instagram numbers. But here at the church, we're actually not looking for performance. We actually want to validate that the Spirit moves in you, and that is for you to actually become a world changer. But that happens at the community level. You can't just, grow up and say, I'm a world changer. That comes with the community.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I hear that, like, I think I get it, but one of the pushbacks might be, well, what if we put someone on the pulpit and they say something really like
Yeah.
really wrong, right?
Yeah.
So like how would you address that concern?
So that's a great point. So black churches would have somebody preach in front of like the small groups before they're allowed to do it at big church, so to speak.
Mhm.
I think similar things need to be done in a Korean American setting too. But I think one of the things that's really good for us, and this is why I think the idea of reimagining or restructuring church is so important, is if when we give that kind of responsibility, hey, you are preaching the word for the congregation so that God might speak to his people, right? That's a pretty high mantle, big mantle. And so when we get to that point, we really want to make sure that there are many workshops. And also, this is really important too, is that there is dialogue, that there is feedback, because again, this is something the Black church does really well. Like, hey, preach it, say it again, say it louder. That type of dialogue with the preacher allows him to know in real time, oh yeah, this is the spirit affirming.
Mm.
There are lots of times where the crowd can go quiet and lean in and listen and be like, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Now again, I think we're probably from more of an intellectual or cognitive bent, where Bible studies might need to be more participatory, or you could have discussions about that where the other pastors or other preachers can say like, hey, you know it's interesting is in, I think it's First or Second Kings, where they talk about the school of prophets, right? So I almost think you can have a school of preachers or a school of prophets as well, as to say like, hey, tell me where you got to that point. David, you preached this on Sunday. Hey, can you tell me why did you make that pivot here? I've always felt in my experience that this happens when the Holy Spirit does this, and then we can have a dialogue, as opposed to like, oh, I don't think David should preach again here. I don't think I'm saying, I don't know. Oh, I don't know if that's right. I disagree. I make sure he never does that, has the chance to do that again. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's really dangerous to the future and the leadership pipeline and the preaching pipeline of a dynamic and living organic church community.
Yeah. And when you first mentioned the cultural sins that we need to recognize and kind of weed out, yeah, I think you hit several of them, right? One of the things culturally that we have is this hierarchy in terms of age, but then that leads to a lot of just suppression of younger voices. That I mean, Timothy in the Bible was really young, but Paul encouraged him and told him, don't be discouraged because of his youth. But the other thing that you just talked about is the whole like shame
Mm,
culture that we have, of like when we see someone like messing up like that, instead of like being able to just confront that and say, hey, let's talk about it,
yeah,
we tend to get into our little bubbles of gossip and say, okay, let's not let this happen again. Let's I think there's the idea is that we're trying to shield them from shame, but I think in doing so, we don't really leave a lot of room for growth.
right.
So what you're saying makes total sense to me. And one other thought is, I think the idea of encouraging people to talk can only happen when you like know what they're saying. But
That's
the
right.
the model of church, one of the things that I think mega churches, I mean, they do good work. There are things that they do well. They are
Yes,
positive influences for sure, like Hillsong and all of them. But if the church is structured in a way where there's one head pastor and thousands of people just being led by one head pastor, then it's impossible for that head pastor to really know what those thousands of people are saying and thinking, right? Uh,
absolutely.
so would you say that's another kind of a restructuring thing that needs to be considered in terms of like how we do discipleship within the church?
Absolutely. I think that in Ephesians, you see this sort of the fivefold offices of the offices of apostles, prophets, teachers, evangelists. So when you see that model, and we only have pastors, sort of employed by the church, we need a head pastor. Well, why not a prophet? Oh, because that we don't. Why not?
Mm,
So I think that because of that absence, you have people that have gifts to equip the body to love and serve God, but they're not given any place. And so I think it's very dangerous regarding that. So I think that we need to figure out how to flatten the structure a little bit.
mm,
It's too top down. I think the obviously the modern conception of church is really based on sort of a corporate model, like, oh, the CEO,
Right.
that type of model. But I think it works for business if you have a product, if you have a consumer. But to model the church after that is very dangerous to our souls.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just thinking through that because it is so true. When you look at even the bigger organizations of like the Southern Baptist Convention or like the synods of like the Presbyterian Church, it is very like the hierarchy. It is very like it looks like an organization chart like that you would find at a business.
Yeah.
So, do you have any thoughts on how, like, what are some steps? Like, let's say a pastor is listening to this and says, you know what, I agree with what they're saying. Let's try to flatten our church a little bit. Like, what are some actionable things that you think they can do to try to get there? Or is it not as simple as that?
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure you can tweak it. I mean, you can tweak it. I think there are very bold and daring and courageous pastors that are all the time tweaking and trying to figure out. But I'm not so sure that this can be done incrementally without critiquing the system.
Hmm.
But I do think we do need a reinvention of a system.
Hmm.
Because if the system is not overhauled, then I think we're assuming that the status quo will repair itself. But I think in your generation and my generation, I've seen a lot of people walk away from the church altogether.
Yeah.
And so if you said like, hey, we're not going to play this kind of music, we're going to play a different kind of music. Oh, we're not going to preach for 45 minutes. We're going to preach for 30 minutes. It doesn't matter.
Right.
They're not coming back. That's not why they're leaving. They're leaving because there's no sense of reflection and invention about what it means to be the body of Christ in the world. And the current model, I mean, even if we say like, this model has been held in high regard since the 80s, the mega church.
Hmm.
And whether you're a small church or not, a lot of small churches are still mega churches just in mini form. Like they're structured and their goals and their tools and the mediums for what they're doing is the same as a mega church. They're just not there yet.
Hmm.
And maybe they don't have the personality to pull it off. Maybe they don't have the tools to pull it off, but that's still what they're aspiring to. But I think we have to question whether or not the mini mega church or the mega church is functional in terms of a disciple making organization at all.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I submit that I don't think it is.
Hmm. So, I mean, because to me, when I hear this conversation, and I'm thinking about it as we're talking, so this might not be a. Let me know if this doesn't sound right.
Sure, sure. I don't know anything either, so your guess
No,
is as good as mine.
but it just sounds like there needs to be like actual disciple making.
That's right.
I think the buck right now in a lot of churches, the buck stops at the pastor. Like the pastor holds all the responsibility, like in terms of just everything, like preaching, setting up programs at church, everything. It's at the pastor's level, and they delegate a few things to some of the lay leaders. Like me, like I'm a lay leader at my church. Some things get delegated to me, but ultimately the buck stops with my pastor, right?
Mm,
So it sounds like to me that there needs to be a model where the pastor isn't doing everything.
yeah, that's
Um,
right.
where because I always like going back to this. Jesus really only discipled like 12 people. Like he didn't really when it started looking like there was going to be a mega church forming around him, he like
Yeah,
he retreated, right? Yeah.
right.
So it sounds like to me that first of all, pastors need to equip people to be kind of like maybe for lack of a better term, mini pastors within the
That's
congregation.
right. That's right.
And maybe, and not to put everything on the pastor, like people who attend churches need to be more invested and be
Yes.
willing to become mini pastors. But,
Yes.
mm,
I think that's part of the key, right?
mm,
Is if you came to church, so like when you go to the gym, you don't just watch the guy run a spin class
mhm,
and be like, well, maybe someday I could probably do that. You
right.
know, you actually have to get on a spin cycle yourself, right? And have to be like, okay, we're doing this, butts up, like, hey, we're doing a countdown, and all that stuff. You have to do that with the teacher. So that's one aspect of discipleship too, but also to say like, why is it that we come to church not expecting to speak at all? like not
Mm,
expecting to engage the word at all. I expect somebody to have a prepackaged feed me with the word. But
mhm,
we need to actually create a culture where we're expected to engage right away. Like, okay, I want you to, I like how Presbyterians, like they say like, oh, so this person's going to read the word for us today, but they're not going to teach on it. So, it's kind of a mere formality. I'm like, okay,
mm,
whatever. I'll read it for myself. Okay, he's going to read it. Okay, whatever. But what if it was like, I'm reading it, but I give hey, this is my first take. I'm reading it for the first time. But then we say like, okay, somebody who sat with this text all week, they're going to also follow me. And then somebody who's been wrestling with this text for 10 years,
mhm,
they're going to follow. So you can see cumulative way of reading scripture, this text today. It would be really interesting if we had more people like programmed to share. Oh, I know that a lot of people guard the table pretty carefully. Who can lead communion, or sometimes they're just holding the bread and be like, oh, the body of Christ broken. But what it would be like for us to lead communion? There's no scriptural reason why people can't say, this is
mm,
what Jesus has done for me. I mean, we have people that the way it's been described for me is like, if you can lead a toast at a banquet
mhm,
or at your house and say like, hey guys, thanks for coming over, I just want to shout out thanks, blah blah, I can't, let's have a toast for life, for a good life. If you can do that at your house, that's what Jesus did with the bread. Like, this is my body broken for you so that we
mm,
might have life. And we're going to be able to celebrate this same meal with Jesus again.
mm,
Let's all eat. That this is like a foreshadowing of what is to come. Well, why is it that only pastors, elders do this?
mm,
I should know how to do this. And one of the sort of things we say at Open Table is like, every table, your kitchen table, your coffee table, these are all communion tables.
wow.
We need to change our mindset around who can say what and do
Mhm,
what. We should all be at least licensed, permitted to fail, but definitely try.
mm. Oh, that's so good. Because one of the things that, I mean, because I'm a lay leader, like I'm very involved at my church. So I like everything you're saying really is like, yeah, that's how a church should be done. And I think that's how church is being done right now. But when I think about some of the people at our church, like they consider going to service and listening to the sermon as kind of enough. They come in, they listen to the sermon and say, oh, that was good. That'll hold me over for a week. And they don't engage in any of the conversations that can happen afterwards.
Mm,
Like one of the things that we try to do with our so we have small group like 30 minutes after the service,
mm.
and we encourage everyone to talk, and we read a Bible verse, and we try to get people's perspective on it, and like it's a very open forum, right? But
Ah,
those
great.
are those are really they're not popular. Like a lot of like when we do it, it's pretty much like a lot of times it's just the leadership team, and like
Mm.
people like the I mean, I don't want to call it just regular congregation members, but for lack of better terms, just a regular everyday congregation member, they don't like coming to those things.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I guess it's a challenge for those people as well, right? To say, hey, like let's try to engage more. And is there anything that we can tell? Like, can you think of anything that we can tell them to entice them or maybe like motivate them to be more engaged?
Well, if you want to change the culture, you have to recognize you're not going to make everybody happy. You have to
Mm,
you have to warn them that church is not meant to be comfortable all the time. And then ultimately, like you said about leadership, if leaders want followers to begin to lead, leaders have to lead less. So it's
mm,
very threatening to the identity of the leader. Because
mm,
what made you a leader? Well, you're good at what you do. Well, what if we said, hey, David, we know you're good at this, but I actually need you to not do it as much
mm,
and let somebody who's not as good at as you are to try it, even if it feels like, oh man, why? I could do that. Why are you doing that?
right, right.
When we have worship leaders who aren't as good of musicians and still can worship, then we're getting somewhere. I realize
Mm,
I've been preaching at Open Table for over 10 years. If I'm the only preacher in the room after 10 years, I'm doing something wrong. I might be a good preacher, but it's not enough for me to be a good preacher. That's the same thing as somebody saying, I'm the best spin class teacher here. Well, after 10 years, there should be at least somebody as good as you are, and you might be over functioning as a spin teacher. So
Right.
same way, it's like, if we really care about discipleship, and you should give yourself some time frame, like in 3 years I should be able to sort of walk away from this and take a sabbatical, or in 7 years or in 10 years. But without that mentality, I think we all tend to have this sort of identity that this is who I am and this is what I do. But I think Jesus is always, his example, like you said, he models something that's sort of transient, that is, I'm not going to be here
Mm,
for, I'm here for now, but I'm not always going to be here. And I think if our churches don't understand, like even our best pastors, if they don't fill us with the sense of like, you know what, I need to anticipate my pastor not being here, because the church is not about the pastor. The church is about following Jesus. But I'm going to assume, or I'm going to correlate my church with this pastor.
mm.
That's the wrong correlation.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we talked about yesterday that is relevant to this is like we see the danger in that, right? Because even the most kind of, I guess, famous pastors, like
Mm.
their ministries can fall apart within seconds. One of the pastors we talked about yesterday was like Hillsong, New York's Carl Lentz. He's a big celebrity pastor. Um, oh, is that your
Sorry,
dog? No, it's okay.
interrupted by my dog. Yeah.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, like I don't know because I don't go to that church, but I can imagine that there are some people that go to Hillsong, New York, that were devastated,
Yeah.
and maybe even like questioned their faith
Sure.
because of that, right? I
Sure.
mean, for me personally, when Ravi Zacharias, I mean,
Mm.
he passed, but after his passing, news of like sexual misconduct came up.
Mm.
And when it first came up, if I'm going to be honest, I said, no way. Like that has to be false. Someone's trying to tarnish his legacy.
Yeah.
But the Ravi Zacharias ministry actually came out with a statement saying, hey, we investigated and it's looking like it's true.
Yeah.
It was like hard for me to take. He wasn't my personal pastor. It was just someone I looked up to. But even for me, it was
Yeah.
like, oh, whoa. So I think there definitely is danger in like having a single pastor model where
Yeah.
um yeah, like people's faith is almost connected to that pastor, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So but as let me ask you, as a pastor, when you see things like that happen, like what do you think? Like what are the emotions that you go through? Do you just say, oh, that person wasn't a good pastor, or like do you
No, I think he's human.
mm,
I think when you create a celebrity, because so there's a sort of there's this cultural milieu that we're all sort of swimming in, which is to say, when you have consumerism, you're creating consumers and you're creating celebrities at the same time. You're creating ambassadors, right? And when you sort of idolize those ambassadors, you create a very unhealthy power dynamic where people who flock, anybody who gets groupies, I don't care whether you lead 30 or 50 or 100 or 1,000, there is something weird. And I mean, it's so funny because social media is starting to bring this out. When I think in my head, I get in this idea that, oh, 100 people are watching me. You kind of act differently. It
mm,
changes, like, well, I better make sure I write this text because I'm speaking to dozens, and it's
right.
right. It does something to you. So when somebody like Ravi Zacharias, who has the ear and admiration of thousands,
Yeah.
it does something to you. And for any human, any of us who have needs and desires and addictions and wounds, we're all prone to fall into these sort of snags,
Mm,
because there's like adoring people. And I don't care if you're at a small church or a huge ministry or whatever. I think that temptation is there, and it is fine, or I guess it's not fine. It is natural for us to be like, oh, I can't believe it.
mhm,
I can believe it. If you were in that spot, if
mhm,
somebody put a spotlight on you, tens of thousands of people adoring you, taking note of your shoes and, oh my gosh, your turn of phrase. Oh my gosh, like take that sound bite, retweet that, taking videos of you, wanting to take pictures with you, waiting for, when are you going to preach again, David? Oh, Pastor, when that does something to you, but
Yeah.
that's never meant to be, which is why Jesus subverts his own popularity, which is why Jesus hangs out with Pharisees as well as prostitutes and drunkards and gluttons and the lepers. This kind of Jesus, this kind of celebrity, we don't really understand. And the celebrities that do that, even in our time, we actually like, I mean, he's great, but it's kind of weird. You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
think that's where, if Ravi Zacharias was celebrated by the poor as much as he was celebrated by the scholars, I think that would be like, okay, this guy's a whole person. He's sober. But I'm telling you, anytime he's just like the darling of this, man, be careful.
Yeah.
You don't know that. You don't know that dude.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, and then that's sobering when you say he's human. Because whenever things like when like the whole Carl, so Ravi Zacharias was a different thing. When the Carl Lentz thing happened, like I was like, oh, I'm not surprised. That guy, like that's I mean, I don't think that's that's the proper reaction to a pastor falling like or falling to sin like that. But I thought that, and the next thought was, man, if I was in his position, that would never happen to me.
Oh man, you don't know.
Exactly. So I think yeah, it's to know that I think should uh influence and inform pastors around us of why this restructuring thing we're talking about, why
Yeah.
it's important to yeah, because no one knows how they're going to react in front of temptation like that, right? So
Yeah.
to kind of subvert that and say the church's faith and the standing of this church is not going to be on my shoulders, but it's going to be spread out to the people of the church. I think that just makes more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, structurally and for people's faiths, for to give people room to grow, all of that, I think it makes total sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we get there? Any thoughts on how can we? Because to me, I mean, I'm convinced. I think that's the way that the church needs to move. I think we should be encouraging churches to adopt this kind of model, quote unquote, that we've kind of discussed. But can you think of? Well, first of all, let me ask you this: have you shared this with people who've shown opposition to it, who've pushed back on wanting to do something like this?
I don't know. I don't think I'm that original. I think, like you said, you've been thinking a lot of thoughts like this yourself. I've been thinking a lot of thoughts. I think the question is can you do it in this wineskin? Can, like, if you, like, you're a lay leader at your church, would your church allow you to say to your pastor, like, hey, let's reinvent the wheel? Like, I know I'm a lay leader, but why don't you make us all lay leaders and just put us on a rotation basis? I know you preach every Sunday, or 49 out of 52 Sunday. How about you preach just for 5 minutes and then you say, I'm giving the rest of the sermon, and then have us rotate. So you do the introduction and we'll all do the middle and the conclusion. Would that be okay? I don't know if they can do it. And here's the thing, like, I'm a pastor as well, but I feel like I have um, failed in the common sense.
Mm.
Because I have failed in the common sense, like, I recognize, like, our church isn't really going to be popular. The way we're doing it's not going to be popular. Why? Because I don't, like, if you come in, if you're an introvert at all, like, oh, you're asking everybody to share how they're doing, like, you're gonna, okay, we're all gonna speak here, we're all share, we're all gonna say this prayer together. If you're an introvert, you're kind of like turned off. Oh, I
Yeah.
feel so uncomfortable. And I think it took Open Table, when we started doing more dialogue and stuff, I would say it took a year and a half before every Sunday, maybe not every Sunday, but very frequently over a year before it became like, yeah, we're weird. This is what we do.
Mm.
But before, it was just like, that's weird. I'm not doing it.
Mm. Yeah.
Anytime you break the form and you keep saying the church is not meant for your comfort, the church is meant for your transformation.
Mm.
Church is not meant for your comfort. It's meant for your transformation. You keep saying that and you do it and you actually do it. You will start to find that people have, oh, but I'm uncomfortable here. And they don't know what to do with their discomfort. So then you actually have to say, what does Christ teach us to do? And you have to sort of walk. This also is discipleship. Because at some point, shouldn't the church make you uncomfortable?
Right.
We can't make you feel. What are you going to do if Jesus makes you uncomfortable? It starts to build on itself. But I think that's where we have to recognize the church. In order to build resilient Christians, we also need resilient churches. And that means the church needs to risk dying. The church needs to risk loss, because that's what it means for you personally to evangelize, personally to sort of forsake your finances or the next job or the next whatever. It's going to feel risky to you, right? Well, collectively, we should take risks. Collectively, we should figure out, hey, you know what? We have a great church, but I think God's called us to more than this. You guys want to do it? And I think it's very hard I have sat in those tables and I've seen organizations say that's just too high of a price to pay. And here's why I say it's a systemic issue. Pastors that go to evangelical or sort of private seminaries, those are very expensive. It's an expensive education. So guess what? That means when they come out of seminary, they need a high paying job. Okay, if you want a high paying job, guess what makes sure that you're going to be able to pay them? Lots of people. Do lots of people like to be uncomfortable at church? No. Do they want to hear a great sermon? Do they want to see a good production and a well performed service? Yes. So the risk to be bold as a Christian and then a Christian community, it's almost sabotaged from the start. So that's why I say it has to actually, the most potential for change comes from the grassroots. People like you who say like, I know I don't have a huge seminary bill. I have other bills that I need to pay, but I could do that doing other things. It's honestly why, like, you asked how I got into all this other stuff, business model and photography. And it's because I believe that I need to be bivocational. I need to model it. I need to figure out what it feels like to earn my paycheck in other ways than just, oh, please come to my church. I can preach better. Oh, you come to my church. Our worship is amazing. What does that mean? Our worship is amazing here. How about, does anybody say our discipleship is amazing here?
Yeah.
The people that are in our church are changing the city. That doesn't happen. Well, the people in our church come to our church. That's what makes them great. But that's a huge it's settling for far less than what the gospel has asked of us.
Yeah, yeah, and that's so good. I understand that, and I think the full circle that happens when we stop caring about the paycheck, quote unquote, and really invest into people. I think what's going to happen is there are going to be people who come about and say, like our pastor is working multiple jobs. Let's support him or her so that they don't have to work multiple jobs. Like, I think that's eventually like where we can get to, because the thing I think about a lot is like the church in Acts, right? After, because no one was really in need, and people, when they saw each other's needs, they took care of each other, people who had a lot. And so like that's like the perfect image of what I think a church should be, and I think that's what a church could be if we bought into it, right?
Yes.
But I think you're exactly right when you say we need to let go of this corporate structure that we have, and some of the shackles that we have in terms of like finances, or maybe even the claim. Like, I think some pastors might even be in a place where it's not about the paycheck, but they want the claim of many, many people instead of like investing into, a few that can then invest into other few, and so on and so forth.
That's right.
So, I think this is a really timely conversation because COVID, I think it did a lot to the church. I think it shook up the church. Some of the people who were kind of just casual attendees, I think a lot of them, I can't speak for all churches, but at my church, at least, there were a lot of people who were kind of just casual that never really tuned in to the
Mhm.
online services, never really came to the Zoom Bible studies and things like that. So, I mean, it happened anyways. No matter how much the pastors didn't want it to happen, it happened. So it might be an opportune time to really consider this structure,
Yeah.
consider, the more of the flattened version of church where God can use many people to speak, to
Yeah.
teach, to lead. So yeah, thank you so much for that, for your thoughts on this. Because
Oh, yeah. Thanks for entertaining them.
no, and I think it's really important. And I know, yeah, people listening, I think even if you're not a pastor at your church, I think this is something that you need to really think about and consider. Maybe even bringing it up to your pastors, because we always talk about the Great Commission, go out and make disciples, but we always turn it into go out and tell people about your pastor so that your pastors can make disciples. Like,
Mm,
I don't think we take it as a personal thing. I think we think about it as a commissioning
right.
of the church rather than like a personal thing, because you are the church, right?
That's right.
um and so, supremely important conversation we're having today, I think, Pastor David.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
hope so.
Oh, we're actually, no, we have like 10 minutes before we hit the hour mark, but I wanted to ask a little bit more about some of the, because one thing I want to make sure that we do is constantly reevaluate ourselves. And when I say we, I'm talking about the Korean American community,
Mm.
but specifically for the Christians. Are there things that you've kind of witnessed us doing that we shouldn't be doing, or things that we can be doing better? So basically, I'm asking you to critique the Korean American church, right? Not because I'm like I want to say that you're a hateful person, because you're not, but in hopes of bettering ourselves, in hopes of yeah, growing. Are there things that you think that you can critique the Korean American Christian community on?
Well, I want to be careful about the spirit of critique and shame,
Mm-hmm.
and guilt inducement. I have been very critical before, and one of the things I think is I have to acknowledge is that I the Korean church is my mother, right? Like,
Mm.
Augustine says the church is my mother. Um, I feel like that way about the Korean church. But I do think that it's really important for the church to not take itself so seriously, in the sense that we are not each, particularly the way it is right now. We have to recognize when the New Testament was written, it was written to the church of a city. Right now, we have, I mean, even in the metro Atlanta area, we have more than, I don't know, 500 Korean churches.
Mm-hmm.
And each of them takes themselves very seriously, like they're the hope of the world, which I think collectively they are, but individually the reality is they come and go.
Yeah.
And I think if we could be a little bit more sober and human about it, is we do need to take a look at our past and recognize we have a lot of brokenness, that really needs healing. um, there's this book that's very interesting to me. It's called The Haunting of the Korean Diaspora. And it sort of makes this thesis. And these are very broad strokes of the book, but basically saying that when the Japanese colonized Korea and when the Korean War happened, so over a solid 50-year period, the whole nation experienced a collective trauma at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And what trauma has a lot of very uh, profound effects on a person. But because our people experience that trauma all at the same time, we are all walking sort of traumatized. And what comes out of that trauma is, the book posits that we have a collective amnesia and a sense of identity loss. And there's a lot of anger underneath that, which finds itself a lot of demons in sort of alcohol and workaholism, in uh, pornography and addictions to all kinds of things. And then a portion of that community comes to immigrate to America, and there's a different there's an additional anxiety of like, coming to a land where you don't speak the language, where you don't know why everything is so litigious and political, and you're a pawn in a game that you really don't know you were playing, and you're just trying to make enough money for your. And then the weird part is, by the second generation, some of us break through, right? We're one of the Asian Americans as a whole are well educated and high salary earning, but there are a lot of dark shadow sides to that. Whether it's a lot of self hate and alcoholism and anger and broken marriages and broken families that I don't know if the church is really addressing.
Yeah.
I know the answer is still Jesus, but Jesus asked a blind man what he wanted Jesus to do, and he still had the answer. I would like to see.
Mm,
Not just to come to you, Jesus, not to just be heard by you, Jesus, but I still need to tell Jesus what it is that I need healing from.
mm,
And I don't know if the Korean church has gotten that specific about what it is we need to be healed from. We're just,
mm,
well, I just want to know you, Jesus. I want to be with you. Well, he's still going to ask us, what is it that
yeah.
you want me to do? And the power of confession is in that level of specificity. The power of our transformation comes when we know what we're asking Jesus for.
Mm. So I guess the challenge for the Korean American church would be to identify like what we need healing from, even, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Because I think, yeah, I think it's common knowledge amongst all of us that there is trauma. But yeah, when you talked about it, when I was trying to figure out what specifically, I couldn't really answer like
Mm,
the specifics of the things that we're trying to heal from. But I'm glad you brought that up because I think one of the things that so I'm gonna speak personally. One of the things I've been struggling with is anxiety
mm,
and kind of like a little bit of depression. And I talk about it openly on the podcast before, but I never really knew why it was happening. Like I never really knew where it was coming from.
mm.
I mean, I have a great job. I have a wife who loves me like crazy. I have a beautiful baby daughter. My parents, they're really great. Like there's like no reason on the surface why I should have felt anxiety. I thought, but it wasn't until I actually like started going to therapy and
Yeah,
started getting professional help that I realized there were like deeper rooted, seated things that was like self hate, like things
yep,
like where I was, like imposter syndrome of like, do I really know what I'm doing? Like, there were a lot of things underneath that we were able to identify that I wouldn't have been able to get to on my own.
yeah,
And I will
that's right.
even say that as wise and awesome as my pastor is, counseling from my pastor wouldn't have gotten me there either.
Yeah,
So I think and it's working against us because there's this shame culture in Koreans
yeah,
where if you admit that you're having mental problems, like you need mental health assistance,
yeah,
there's something that there's like a veil of shame over you immediately when you admit that. But I think that's something that we need to break through as a group and say, if I'm having issues, I need to seek help. And I
yeah,
think one thing is because I actually spoke to a pastor about this. He said there are things, a lot of things I can help guide you with. I can pray over you with, and things like that. But there are a lot of things where you need to feel comfortable seeking professional help in, because pastors are, you know, they're not superheroes. They can't do everything. Like if I'm sure for you as well, Pastor David, if one of someone from your church came to you with a real like psychological, like mental
mm,
issue, you might not be equipped to address that. But I think that's something that we need to be more open about. In order to heal from trauma, I think we need to be willing to go out and um, destigmatize getting being mentally healthy. Yeah.
oh, you're absolutely right, David. And I think I will say that being a pastor has made me much more my inadequacies and insufficiencies to cover the breadth of issues that I face on a week to week basis
Mm,
are made very apparent. I am like and seminary doesn't train you for the breadth of problems that you'll face.
mm,
And I think it's really, and this is why I think the body of Christ, like the community, we need to approach this communally,
Mm,
because there are people in the body that are really hurting. And there are a lot of people who, and this is the thing, pastors are, I know one of the things that I think is hard for a pastor to do is recognize how human I am.
mm,
I may have gone to seminary, may have mastered divinity, I have not mastered humanity. I and honestly, having a child has brought me to my knees, because it is ultimately, I think it's the most humanizing sort of factor, like
mm,
to break you out of your selfishness and break you out of the sense that the world doesn't revolve around me. I know very little to impact the world.
mm.
And I think that's been a really humanizing process. But I think that's actually where divine work begins, is when we all recognize how human we are and how much in need and how in awe we should be, that the incarnation is not just a fancy theology, but is a reality for us.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. And but I do want to say though, it takes a special type of person to be a pastor. So I mean, I've only this is only our second conversation, but I can tell from having this conversation with you that you have a level of love for the people that normal people don't have. So I mean, pastors are definitely special, but they don't. They're not equipped to handle every single situation. So I hope when I say that. There are things pastors can't handle. That doesn't diminish uh, the abilities that pastors have. The because pastors are really great spiritual counselors. You know, like you can approach them for a lot of things, and I'm sure you've had many conversations where you were really helpful for the people that you were talking to. But I think you put it so eloquently. We're all human, and recognizing that. I think I think that's one of the things, actionable things that the Korean American church needs to do. I think we tend to put our pastors on the pedestal, and really like, and I think it comes from the culture that we have of respecting our elders, of respecting our authority figures. But I think we take it to a level where we expect too much out of them, and so it ends up burdening pastors. So yeah, that,
Well,
that was
I'm not in a Korean American church, so I don't feel idolized. But I think that's one of the things that's helped me become more sober about the work of
Mm,
pastoring. Is you may be right, the calling and vocation, the pastoral vocation may have something distinctive to it,
mhm,
but it's not so distinctive that others couldn't do it. And
mm,
others, like that's like saying, like, well, there's something special about parents, they're just really phenomenal. Well, actually, you just need a child, and that will make you a parent. And
yeah.
if you're going to be really present, if you're going to show up to that, the child will teach you how to be a parent. It's going to
Mm.
kill you, but if you let it, you will be changed.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Well, we're at our hour mark, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. Any kind of last thoughts and anything that you wanted to discuss today that we didn't get to hit?
Oh, I mean, I don't. We
Yeah.
covered a lot of ground, and I really
Yeah.
appreciate you taking the time to listen and ask questions.
I know. I think, man, this is a very dense episode today. We talked about a lot of things, but I think if the listener really takes time to think about these things and consider them, I think, yeah, there can be transformation that happens within the Korean American churches that, yeah, that put a yeah that takes us in a more positive direction. And like I said before, I think post COVID would be a really good time for it to happen because yeah, the church has been shaken up so much. Um, Again, Pastor David, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your wisdom and yeah, your willingness to share these things. It was really enlightening for me, and I'm sure the listeners, um, yeah, will be just as enlightened. If people have any questions for you or any comments for you, are you open to receiving them?
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah. So, guys, any questions or any comments that you might have from today's episode, feel free to email me at IHTHT podcast. That's I hope they hear this abbreviated podcast at gmail.com, or on Instagram at I hope they hear this, or on Twitter at IHTHT podcast. And any comments or questions towards Pastor David, I will make sure he gets them. So yeah, please feel free to engage with us. Well, thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks again.